Good morning, everyone. Just letting all of our attendees join in this morning, and we will be starting at 9:30. We will be starting in 2 minutes. Lots of participants joining, which is fantastic. We'll just give everyone a couple more moments to join. All right, it is 9:30 this morning. I do see that more participants are joining, but we have an awful lot on the line here today. So I'll just start here while everyone else joins. Good morning, everyone. Thank you all so much for joining us today on this beautiful day. Well, during today's webinar, we will be discussing the Families First, the CARES Act, and the impact on your employee benefits plan. For today's session, Summit is proud to partner with McAfee and Taft. We do have the question and answer feature available, so you can submit questions through that option. But please note that we have hundreds of attendees joining us today. And with this meeting being so brief in time, we would appreciate if you could direct any questions to the email address marketing@yoursummit.com. Don't worry, I will display that email address again at the end of the session today. But with that said, let's get started. Here are some of our disclosures that are required by Cetera. We have 3 guests joining us today. Our first is Brandon Long. He is an experienced AV preeminent rated employee benefits attorney for McAfee and Taft. He represents regional and national clients with thousands of employees, including large publicly traded corporations and governmental entities. His achievements have earned him inclusion in the Chamber's USA Guide to America's Leading Lawyers for Business, the Best Lawyers in America, and the Oklahoma Super Lawyers. Brandon serves as the leader of the firm's Employee Benefits and Executive Compensation Group. Our next panelist is Todd Rolland. He serves as president of Summit's Employee Benefits Practice. Having been with the company since its founding, he has tackled the most unique and complex employee benefit situations. His experience is diverse and spans multiple industries. This perspective enables him to mitigate risk and guide clients to time-test and creative solutions. Todd's professional designations include Certified Employee Benefits Specialist, Registered Employee Benefits Consultant, Retirement Plans Associate, and Group Benefits Associate. Our last panelist is Kaci Skidgel. She is the president of Retirement Plans for Summit, overseeing group retirement planning and individual wealth management. Kaci is the author of the book, Path to the Summit, Strategies to Reach Your Company's Peak Retirement. And she was acknowledged as one of the top women advisors by the National Association of Plan Advisors for 5 consecutive years. Most recently, Kaci was named by Financial Times as one of the top financial advisors. With those introductions said, I'm going to pass this off to Brandon, who will be moderating today's session.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you again for joining. The idea behind today's webinar, Q&A, whatever this is really, we've given a lot here at McAfee Taft. We've given a lot of information out on the legal requirements and legal issues that we're seeing related to the coronavirus. And this really, the idea behind this is let's hear and learn about the consulting side. What kinds of things should employers and clients be thinking about as it relates to the health consulting side and the retirement consulting side? And so while we're going to cover some legal stuff, this really is intended for me to learn with you from Todd and Kaci and kind of hear what all of us should be thinking about on the consulting side. We're first, in terms of format, we're going to cover Todd and the health side first, and then we're going to shift over and talk to Kaci. Todd, by the way, looks like he's got a green screen or something fancy behind him. Kaci looks very professional. So I'm going to try to not give Todd too much of a hard time digitally here. So just kind of kick off and knock out the legal stuff. And again, we're shifting over to the health and welfare side first. I thought it might be good just to give you a little bit of an overview of some of the legal requirements related to the health and welfare side very briefly, and then we're going to shift over to Todd because I'm honestly more interested in what Todd has to say, and I suspect and hope that you may be as well. On the health plan side, the CARES Act, which was signed into law last Friday by President Trump, it really impacted mostly the retirement side of the house. And so we'll talk about that with Kaci. But on the health and welfare side, there's not a lot of changes to discuss related to laws and health plans, except the Families First Act, which was signed into law, I think 10 days ago or something like that, a little more than, requires plans to cover a coronavirus test with no cost sharing to the employee. No out-of-pocket costs, no amounts toward deductible. Does not require coverage of treatment related to the coronavirus, although you can provide coverage for treatment if you like at no cost. But it does the test itself. You can't impose any cost sharing. One thing that's interesting, I think, is that we're not clear about whether that applies to only in-network providers or to out-of-network providers as well. And I think the consensus seems to be that for now, we should be covering the coronavirus test as it relates to in-network and out-of-network providers, along with the related office visit. And so if someone goes in and sees their doctor, it's not just the test, it's the office visit as well, the urgent care visit, the ER visit that goes in that. And the other thing to mention here is you're not allowed to, a plan is not allowed to apply any sort of medical management. In other words, you can't tell Brandon Long, your employee, that I have to have a negative flu test first before you are going to cover a coronavirus test with no cost sharing. There can't be any of that. So for now, there's not any additional coverage required. The one kind of caveat, the CARES Act, which was signed into law on Friday, I said it has mostly retirement plan implications, and that's true. But it also requires coverage of preventive care related to the coronavirus. right now, so like, for example, if they develop a vaccine or, something along those lines that will prevent someone from getting the coronavirus, plans are going to be required to cover and provide coverage for that. But beyond that, nothing else for now. I think we will get some additional guidance soon. There have been a few new things related to telehealth we can talk about, but if you don't mind, I'm going to just jump right into Todd. And Todd, tell me just generally kind of what are the things that you are dealing with on the consulting side? I know the questions I'm getting from clients on the legal side and legal questions, but tell us what you're experiencing and seeing on the health side, and also, kind of what things do you think people should be thinking about on the consulting side?
Sure. Thank you, Brandon. There are several issues that are revolving around labor and employment that carry over into the health and welfare side. And I won't talk about those today, but I want to cover some things revolving around furloughing versus layoffs, and some of the criteria, some of the considerations, maybe some of the risk and challenges employers are seeing. So let's start with furlough, and then I'll move on to a few other items: reinsurance, unprecedented considerations with reinsurance, summary plan descriptions, and those types of things. So what we're hearing a lot and what we're being questioned about is really, with a layoff, it's pretty cut and dry. If your organization out there is required to comply with COBRA regulation, then with a layoff, COBRA regulation is in play, the notifications go out, and you work through that process of COBRA administration. But under furlough, as many of you know by now, the employees are not technically actively at work, but from a benefit eligibility standpoint, they are still eligible for the benefits. They're eligible to continue on those benefits, much like an active employee would be. And so I think the industry at large, of furloughs, my understanding being up to 1 year in length, the idea of financial assistance that much of the population is going to experience, coupled with the idea that you can qualify for unemployment during furlough, suggests that a participant may have the wherewithal to make their contributions. But that's extremely challenging because systematically, how do you go out and collect those contributions? So what we're seeing is we're seeing employers, and we're collaborating with employers, and really a lot of those employers are suggesting, you know what, for my population under furlough, we're going to continue to pay the premium, even if it's a contributory plan, meaning the employer's paying a certain percentage of the premium and the participant population is paying a certain percentage through payroll deduction. We're going to defer the payroll deduction during the furlough. At the point in time in which they come back, then we will set up a strategy to collect those contributions that were required. One of the things, though, that to be aware of that I'm looking at here, a big issue is revolving around supplemental life. So I'm not referring to individual voluntary products, but if a group chassis, a group product is offering supplemental life, employers out there need to be aware of portability versus converting to a plan, and how long can we defer those premium payments, because it's very difficult for employers to figure out, how am I going to collect these premiums that are 100% employee paid under a supplemental life program from the employees. So it's really important that you look at the provisions within the plan as it relates to perhaps portability and conversion. Will the carrier extend? And we'll talk a little bit about grace periods in a little bit. Most carriers have gone from 30 to 60 days now, and we'll talk about the ramifications of that. But this is a big issue to think about, because employers may inadvertently lose that supplemental life program that is for the benefit of their employees, since it's employee all paid. So
just to make sure I understand. So what you're saying is when someone is impacted by a furlough and they're not, actively working, there's got to be some sort of a mechanism to collect the premiums for the supplemental life policy, or otherwise what would happen, Todd? The policy lapses, they lose coverage, that kind of thing. And then worst case scenario, someone passes away and you've not really thought about this, and then all of a sudden the employer has exposure potentially for maybe not bringing this to an employee's attention. And I know I run into that legally, those kinds of scenarios where people lose life insurance coverage and then someone dies, sadly, and the employer is the one that's being blamed and for not having insurance coverage. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, that's exactly right, Brandon. It's very difficult. Not only is it going to present a challenge, we've got the financial assistance to employers that can apply for, and then we have the individual assistance. But the question is, how long before I actually can receive an asset that can help me fund these plans? So it's going to be difficult for employers to say, we will go ahead and fund the supplemental premium while my participants are on furlough. When they come back, then we'll put them, we'll have a strategy in advance we've decided on to collect those monies retroactively. So some employers are paying those in premiums. Some are thinking about what they're going to do, as we said here today. So big issue, though.
It seems to me that communicating with your employees about what their options are relative to either continuing that or not, or converting it during this period would be critical, right? I mean, you know what I mean?
Absolutely.
It's like push something out, give participants a choice, tell them what their choices are. That would be the way the thing to do right now. One other comment just on the legal side, and I don't want to digress, because like this supplemental life thing is something I had not thought about. But just everybody remember that if as to your health plan coverage, if someone is furloughed, you may be choosing to keep their coverage in effect, but you need to make sure if your plan document says that someone has to work 24 hours a week or 30 hours a week or something along those lines, you might need to amend your plan document and get with your stop loss carrier to make sure they're on board with it, and they will be at this point in time. But don't just assume because someone is furloughed and you're choosing to continue to give them health coverage and maybe even cover their premiums that their plan, that you don't need to amend their plan, because you may actually need to amend their plan document and get your stop loss carrier's blessing. And if you're that's if you're self-funded. And if you're fully insured, you may need to get your carrier on board with it. But anyway, Todd, go ahead and let's go back to you and reinsurance. Tell us what you want to talk about there.
Yeah, let's move on to reinsurance, Brandon. Some fairly significant considerations here because we have an unprecedented time as it relates to reinsurance. But some of the basic things that I think that employers need to think about and be aware of. One of them that would seem almost ridiculous revolves around acts of war. One of our consultants internally had a client and was doing some research. Our president and some of our military leaders have deemed this, we are at war with a pandemic, of course, not with, another country, if you will. But reinsurance carriers are going to be very stressed during this period of time. And I think it's critically important that consultants review those exclusions and subsequently receive confirmation from the reinsurer that, hey, yes, we're in good shape, we're going to cover this. So things like, act of war. Check on actively at work provisions. I know furlough mandates certain things from a regulatory standpoint, but these are things just to check on because you don't want any surprises post incurrence of some kind of specific claim. I mentioned down here as well, we could very well at some point see government mandates that conflict with reinsurance verbiage. And under ERISA, I know that a lot of us defer to the protection under ERISA. So when the government mandates something, we think, oh, that's going to flow right through to the reinsurance side and we're all going to be fine. But due to the fluidity of the change and some of the changes that could be considered somewhat radical, we need to really, really be in touch with that reinsurance contract, what it states, and we need to be extremely collaborative with that reinsurance carrier to make sure that we have a full understanding of what our client's risk really is.
Todd, I know one thing you and I talked about yesterday is COBRA. I think if you look at ways that or issues that can come up where stop loss carriers, when they're looking for a reason to deny a claim, one of the things that sometimes our employers can stub their toe on relates to COBRA. So I think employers on the legal side need to make sure that they are, to the extent someone has a loss of coverage, because of a reduction of hours or a termination of employment, we need to make sure we're getting our COBRA notices out timely so that we don't give our stop-loss carriers a reason to deny some massive claim. So.
Absolutely. Absolutely. There'll be hyper focus in those types of areas for sure.
Yeah.
FMLA transitioning into COBRA qualification, all the different scenarios there we need to really be aware of.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Todd, what do you want to talk about on SPDs? Anything else on the reinsurance?
No, on the we'll move over into what I think is a really good point revolving around minimum attachment points, and want to make sure that the crowd out there, those that are self-funded, have an awareness of what this is. But I just have a few notes here. The amending of plan documents. What I'm seeing as of this morning, one of the top 5 reinsurers in the country suggested that amendments to the plan documents as we go through the pandemic, the timelines I'm seeing are really September 1st. So, the reinsurers would like to see amendments to the plan docs, et cetera, by September 1. So I just wanted to mention that timeline because I really hadn't seen anything as it relates to timelines prior to this. Also, COVID-19, you mentioned the testing for it mandated, but I think our audience really needs to be aware of, and many are by now, the testing versus treatment and the real difference in those two. So plans are going to need to be amended. Plan docs, SPDs will need to be amended to clarify coverage under COVID-19 if they so choose as an employer. So I think that's an important note. Don't just assume that it's medically necessary, and as a result, based upon that alone, it's going to be covered. Because as you know, in the schedule of benefits and the plan doc, it's very specific verbiage. So I wanted to mention that. And then I also wanted to mention, as it relates to this area, we're seeing, as of recent, as an example, we're seeing these medications that now are historically have been utilized to treat other ailments, are now being utilized, a few of those, as a treatment for COVID-19 to try to slow this down or to try to stop it altogether. I would challenge us all to be in communication with the PBMs, the pharmacy benefit managers, understand your formularies under the schedule of benefits, make sure that we have clearance in this area and that you have the flexibility within your plan to be able to provide a benefit to your population that you really desire to provide. Because we're seeing this on a daily basis. So even this morning on the news, I saw where the FDA is a little bit at odds with the federal government in terms of some of these medications that are being utilized to fight this. But at the end of the day, we know how radical this is and how quickly this area is progressing. So I would say, both from a plan doc, schedule of benefits, your formulary, and your PBM, I wanted to mention the prescription area as well, because we may see some of these medications that are not FDA approved yet. And so I think employers need to have a real awareness there.
I think a lot of employers, I'm just thinking out loud, I think a lot of employers are going to want to know what these things cost, right? I mean, so it's like there probably is on one hand, man, I want to give my employees everything they need treatment-wise to fight this. And to the extent you're asking me to cover a drug outside of my normal formulary, I'm all for it because I want to help my employee. And in the back of their mind, they're going to be saying, but what does that mean financially? Are we giving, especially right now, economically? And so I think the consultants, like you, are going to have to help employers understand kind of what things cost. And probably, I suspect, as these drugs come up, you guys will be all over what they are and what they cost and what it means to turn it on or to not turn it on financially.
Absolutely.
Hey, back up on the plan amendment by September 1 or the SPD change. Are you talking about the reinsurance carriers are wanting an amendment in place for coronavirus testing by 9/1 is what you're talking about, or is that something else?
Great question and great clarification, Brandon. Exactly. Yeah, that's what I'm referring to. The reinsurers would like to see it by September 1. We just don't want to present any risk that an amendment's done and the reinsurer doesn't recognize it timely.
And just from my standpoint, a lot of times your TPA is the one generating your health plan document if you're self-funded. But preparing a plan amendment is really not that magical. You could probably do a one pager and just say, effective whatever the date is, pursuant to the Families First Act, we hereby adopt the plan is amended to provide coverage for coronavirus testing in accordance with federal law or something along those lines. And I suspect Summit and Todd could help you with that, but that's a pretty easy thing to do. You don't need to like restate your whole document, or you shouldn't anyway. It should be a pretty easy thing to put in place.
Yeah. Good point, Brandon.
So tell us about, my note here says, and you may have already covered this, but it says unprecedented minimum attachment point awareness. Talk to me about that. What does that mean?
Well, I can get a little wordy at times, Brandon. So really what I'm referring to here is if you're out there and you're self-funded, it's critically important because of the impact that this pandemic is having. Many employers aren't going to be fortunate enough to implement and take advantage of a furlough strategy. Many employers out there are going to be laying off, and many already have. So for those employers that are out there that are self-funded, it's important that the consultants and the client understand the idea of minimum attachment point. And so minimum attachment point I refer to it as a minimum maximum liability under a self-funded plan. And what I'm really referring to is typically the first month under a reinsurance plan, the first month that reinsurer will take the number of employees and dependents times a maximum claims factor, and they will take that calculation on that first month, multiply that times 12, and that dictates a minimum attachment point. And that's really the minimum maximum liability. So the relevance here is if an employer is adding a population to a self-funded plan throughout the plan year, that maximum liability, of course, is increasing because you're adding participants to the plan. Just like if you're in fully insured, you would pay more premium if you added people. But what's not talked about and what's missed sometimes is, what if my population goes from 200 down to 100? And that minimum attachment point was set the first month of the year when they had 200. Some of the reinsurance carriers out there, they track the maximum liability by a floating population from month to month. So it's not as relevant if you have a big layoff because your liability may track that layoff or reduction in employment. But for many reinsurers out there, in fact, the majority of the reinsurers out there, that minimum attachment point is dictated the first month. So if you have that big layoff in the middle of the year and it's a contributory plan, not only are you as an employer perhaps funding for people that don't even exist on the plan, or you're liable, but you're not gaining any of those payroll deductions from the employees either. So just pragmatically speaking, when could this really become a big issue? If a client is experiencing a very significant layoff, reduction in employment, coupled with an extraordinarily bad claims year. And so what we don't want is we don't want employers out there to be presented with this surprise that, hey, all of a sudden I thought my liability was X and my liability is really X plus plus. And I just observe as a consultant out there that it's not talked about a lot because it doesn't come into play a lot. But this is one particular time in which it very well could be extremely important and extremely prevalent.
So Todd, what do employers do? Is it just a matter of asking the consultant to help keep track of that? Or, this, because I'm just candidly, I think a lot of people will not, and you did a great job of explaining it, but a lot of people will not understand what that even means, right? And so it's like, they don't know what to do with that. And so is it a deal where they just raise it with you guys and you guys will help them kind of monitor that and keep track of the impact on their plan?
Absolutely.
Especially, it seems like you've kind of mentioned two variables. If we have a layoff and we have bad claims, if an employer listening to this is experiencing those two things, they probably should be talking with you about that. Is that right?
Absolutely. Yeah.
Okay.
Just ask your consultant about minimum attachment point and what should we be, what should we understand? What should we be thinking? Just
Okay.
be certain that they go over that again. Sure.
Hey, Todd, we've got about 3 more minutes before we shift over to the retirement side in Kaci.
Sure.
What kinds of things should we cover here at the end? What would you like to talk about?
Just want to mention 3 things quickly. I think, is it a good time for premium holiday request? Grace period extensions with most of the carriers that we're seeing from 30 days to 60 days. So that's not mandated right now, but I think if you're an employer out there, be aware that many of the carriers have agreed to a 60-day grace period now in hopes that that 8-week period, if you're furloughing, can kind of take care of some of the issues related to delay premium payments or the inability to collect payroll deductions from employers. So, but during, as it relates to premium holiday, let me just say that if your plan is renewing during this time, say from now to August, and your organization is struggling, you're facing the challenges of cash flow and revenue generation through your business model, then your consultant should be requesting from the carrier and seeing if they would be willing to agree to a premium holiday. And that essentially is just delaying, deferring perhaps the first month premium and spreading that out over subsequent months, or just deferring the payment on the first couple of months of premium payment. So I wanted to mention that. The grace period issue, be sure with your consultants to ask them, hey, is there a way to extend that 30-day grace period to 60 days? Because we're seeing many of the carriers agreeing to that. One thing that I did not have mentioned down in my notes, but that I would like to mention is, surprisingly, within the last week, I've seen a couple of carriers that have said, hey, for our clients, if their renewal is between now and August, if their plan renews between now and August, we are not going to extend a rate increase. Their plan will renew for 1 year with no increase. I know that's rare. I know that's very surprising, but I've seen it. It has occurred. A carrier has come out and suggested that. And then I just want to reemphasize, as it relates to the pharmacy benefit managers, your consultants, make sure you just at least request that your consultants stay very, very close to the pharmacy benefit managers and be in a position to advise you, their client, as it relates to any changes that they may think they may need to be making as it relates to your plan, as it could affect your population, or it could affect the cost of your plan as a result of these new meds. I think that's critically important as well, Brandon. So those are just a few of my closing thoughts.
Thank you, Todd. I know you guys are doing, I think you're doing another one of these next week, another kind of Q&A kind of thing. I don't know if it's next week or the time after, but one of the things that I am interested in hearing about, and I bet other people, is once we get through all of this craziness that we're in right now, and the world starts coming back to the normal rhythm of things, like what kinds of issues are employers going to deal with on the consulting side as we start kind of ramping back up? We start adding people again, we start getting our workflow, our workforce to its normal size. Nothing for you to answer right now, Todd, but it's just, I think that's a topic I think would be awesome to hear from on the consulting side in one of these future discussions. So sure. Thanks so much. Great job. So
you're welcome. Thank you.
I'm going to shift over now to Kaci on the retirement side. Wait for Kaci to pop up here.
Hello.
Hello. Kaci looks so much more professional than Todd. Good morning. Yeah.
Good morning.
So we're going to talk about retirement plans. On the Kaci is an investment consultant and helps committees with issues related to their qualified retirement plans. And I'm just curious, what are the top issues and questions you're getting from employers regarding COVID-19 and its impact on their retirement plans? What kind of questions are you getting, Kaci?
Sure. Well, and before I jump into kind of that, I just want to obviously say thank you, Brandon, to you for your leadership. I know McAfee has done quite a bit as well already, giving information. I know it's helped people like me. I know it's also helping our clients. And so we've given people just a reminder that, there are also things from that perspective that people want to key into over these next several weeks. And to our employers and our clients that are on the call today, we know that you have a lot going on. We understand that we want you to stay safe and to be able to protect your employees during this time, and the impact to your business has been great. So we want to be a resource for that. And with that, I mean, I think the kind of key three things that we have been getting recently, the first one is really, can we stop our employer contributions? I feel like, Brandon, that's been the biggest one that has really, it was the first question that all of our employers just started reaching out and saying, what can we do in order to alleviate some of this stress? Are there ways that we can do that? The second one has really been like, what can we do to help employers who are actually laying off employees? And I think we can address together some of the CARES Act, which I know you've been covering as well from a legal perspective, and then just kind of our perception on that from a consultative perspective. And then the final one really has more to do with plan participants. And I don't know if we'll have time today to get to that, but the market volatility has obviously been something that is definitely impacting our employees or our participants that are in retirement plans. So I'd say those are probably the top three that we're fielding calls on.
Okay. And Kaci, just to kind of pull those apart, let's start with the first one about suspending contributions. And I think when we talked about this in advance, this is one I was going to cover. And so if it's okay, I'll just do that real quick.
Absolutely.
So if you're an employer with a defined contribution plan, like a 401k plan, and the question is, can we stop our employer contribution because of the economic stress we're feeling? My initial question I would ask you is, are you a safe harbor plan or are you not? If you are not a safe harbor plan, we'll talk about that first, and that's the easiest. If you just have a discretionary matching contribution, meaning your document says you have the discretion to make a match and to determine the amount of the matching contribution or the amount of a non-elective contribution, there's nothing really you need to do other than stopping contributions. It probably wouldn't hurt you to give your employees a notice to let them know that you're exercising your discretion under the plan to stop contributions. But technically there's nothing required of you. If, on the other hand, you're a non-safe harbor plan and your plan document has a fixed matching contribution, if it's hardwired into your document itself, or you have a fixed employer contribution, again, you're non-safe harbor, but it's actually written into your plan what your contribution will be, you're going to need to amend your plan document to make that change, and you're going to need to give your employees the notice of it. But there's really not any sort of advance notice required relative to that, but you need to amend your plan, and you probably should give your employees a notice. Mm-hmm. The harder question is for those of you that have safe harbor plans. A safe harbor plan, as most of you know, is just a plan that allows you to avoid certain non-discrimination tests. If you're a safe harbor plan, you generally can suspend your safe harbor contribution mid-year, but I want you to look at something for me. Look at your safe harbor notice that you gave out to your employees at the end of 2019. And if it has language that says you have the ability to suspend the safe harbor contribution mid-year, then you're golden. You basically give your employees a notice that says you're suspending their safe harbor contribution. It will be effective 30 days from now. You've got to give them 30 days notice. Then you need to amend your plan document before the effective date to remove or suspend the safe harbor contribution. You also have to basically run your testing on a plan. Instead of having a safe harbor plan, you go back to running non-discrimination testing, the ADP test and the ACP test, using current year testing method. But not to get too far into the weeds, just generally look at your safe harbor notice. If it says you can suspend safe harbor contributions mid-year, you can, but you need to give your employees 30 days notice. The other scenario that you can suspend safe harbor contributions, even if your safe harbor notice did not mention your right to suspend mid-year, is if you're operating at economic loss. And so if you're under financial stress so that your expenses exceed revenues on a year-to-date basis, you can also suspend safe harbor contributions in that scenario. But again, you got to give your employees the 30-day advance notice, and you're going to need to amend your plan. So that's, Kaci, my comments on that. Now, one of the things we talked about is kind of some of the unintended consequences of it, and I might have already covered part of it, but what's your reaction to that in terms of unintended consequences of suspending contributions?
Sure. For our employers, I just always say we need to make sure that you recognize that there could be an ADP, ACP test failure for your highly compensated employees, as well as then you're going to have to satisfy top heavy. And so I know that that's, they're not necessarily thinking, all of our employers they're thinking about today, but those are some things that sometimes pop up a little bit later. So it's one of those gotchas that we just need to have that conversation, talk about it, and then recognize that there may be some other things that pop up later on down the year that you're going to have to be concerned about.
It occurs to me, Kaci, and that's a really great point, that they probably could connect with you and their record keeper and maybe do a little bit of kind of back of the napkin analysis to see what that test looks like right now.
Absolutely.
And if it's going to create problems for them later.
Absolutely.
The other question, or another question you mentioned is that you've been receiving is, how do you help employees who are being laid off or furloughed? And expand on that. Kind of what are you telling employers? And I know this ties into the CARES Act, but
Sure.
Jump right into that if you don't mind.
Yeah, absolutely. So there are two pieces of relief that the CARES Act, and I think you covered that very well, actually, Brandon, on your video that you all had done and released on Monday. But whether you have a hardship or a loan provision in your plan. So what's happened is our employers are coming to us and saying, what can we do to help these people we're having to lay off? And, it's very hard at this point. That is kind of there's a distributable option. It is optional, as I said, for hardships where you're not subject to that 10% penalty withdrawal. So there's kind of a waiver of that, and it's a max of $100,000. You had talked about that. Thankfully, you can pay back your taxes over a period of 3 years. So that's one choice that employers have, is to add in this optional hardship.
One thing I might add there, and you covered it really nicely, is just make sure that these new coronavirus distributions that Kaci just talked about, or the increased loan amount, it only works for qualifying people. Not everybody, not just anybody, can take a coronavirus distribution or an increased loaning. And so, Kaci, who qualifies? Kind of remind us who qualifies for these distributions and loans.
Sure. So, and great point, Brandon. I mean, you have to be diagnosed with the virus, or it's a spouse or a dependent who is diagnosed, or someone that's experienced those adverse financial consequences, maybe reduced hours, they've been laid off, they have that furlough, quarantine. Any of those reasons could be why you might have to, that you would want to take advantage of this. And it is an employee self-certification on this. So there's some pretty generous interpretation for this. But what I would say is employers, you do not have to accept this. You can. And I think that might be something. And the same thing on the loans. While you could offer up to 100% of your vested account balance, or $100,000, it moved from the 50 to 100 for someone who's affected by the coronavirus. Again, you have to qualify for it, but employers don't have to take advantage of that. It's an optional one. And when I say you don't have to take advantage of it, we've had some employers, Brandon, that are saying, as bad as this is, we're actually in a good position. All of our employees are still able to work remotely. We're having, the opposite side of those things affect. So I think it's a one-on-one conversation with your record keeper, with your advisor, consultant, possibly with your attorney, your TPA. Bring in the right parties to make those decisions.
A couple of points, very good comments. So we talked right before this how there are several record keepers, and in the record keepers' defense, they are drinking through a fire hose because this was passed on Friday and basically effective immediately, and that is unheard of in the retirement plan space. Normally laws are passed and they have time to kind of ramp up, but a lot of these record keepers are basically doing an opt-out where they're sending you a notice saying, we're turning these features on, and if you don't want them, you need to let us know. And I've seen at least one major record keeper who's saying, in the $100,000 coronavirus distribution limit, we're not able to monitor that. And so someone theoretically could ask for a distribution of $150,000, and they're not keeping track of it, which is a little scary. So you definitely want to be engaged and have conversations right now. And then last thing before we kind of shift into the last question, one question I've been getting is, you can take these distributions or loans if you've been diagnosed with the virus or your spouse or dependent, and then if you have experienced a financial hardship as a result of a furlough or quarantine. One question I've gotten is, well, what if my spouse has been furloughed or laid off and they've experienced economic hardship? I don't see in the current law that qualifies for a coronavirus distribution or loan. So if a spouse experiences a bad economic situation, at least right now, I don't see clearly that they should be allowed to, the employee should be allowed to take a distribution or a loan. We may get additional regulatory guidance that clarifies that, but let's jump on to the last question here. And this is the one I'm very interested in. What's your advice to employees in retirement plans with all of the market volatility and maybe to employers too, but just kind of what's your overall advice as an advisor?
Sure. And really, I think the main thing is that February 19th, we saw the absolute market record high, but that is so far in our rear view mirror. Like, people are not remembering that we were having a 11-year bull market. So I like to tell people, that these are headlines that they are seeing, and it is real. It is occurring, but none of these headlines necessarily reflect your personal portfolio, your personal timeline, your personal situation. And the 20-year-old versus the 70-year-old is in a completely different boat. So all they can do is control what they can control. We can't control whether or not the market goes up or down. But what we hope is that people have had a plan, develop that plan in partnership with their advisor, and then they stick to the plan that they had. And so as a retirement plan advisor, we're telling people, three things, because we look at usually the long term. Dollar cost averaging is your friend, right? You're getting things every single time that you are investing, and sticking to that plan by staying on course. That would be the second thing. I'm a female. I love a good sale. Right now, everything is at a discounted price for me. So stay the course with what you have selected for your investments. And then the last one is, don't try to time the market. Oftentimes, the 5 worst days in the market are followed by some of the best days in the market. And so we just try to tell people, really stick to the original plan, work with your advisor, have those conversations to allow your advisor to talk further with you about your personal situation. So I'd say those are probably the keys.
Thanks, Kaci. That's great.
Sure. And Brandon,
I think we are, go ahead.
I understand that we are up against, we had said 45 minutes, but I just want to make sure from your perspective, because we've got you, and so thankful again that you would take the time. Is there anything that we're missing? Anything that we need to be making sure that as consultants, or that you would tell our clients who are on the call today that they need to be thinking about?
I'll tell you just kind of 2 very broad things, okay? On the retirement side, if we have layoffs, people need to be thinking about partial plan termination, because they're going to screw that up. If you terminate more than 20% of your workforce, and there's a Wizard of Oz way of math that you calculate that 20%, but if you terminate more than 20% of your workforce, there's a presumption you've had a partial plan termination, which requires vesting and certain things to happen. And I mean, just to be honest with you, I don't make money as an attorney telling people how to do things correctly. I make money when people screw things up. And so, because it's expensive to fix that. So think about it on the front end, and then be very sensitive on the health plan side to stop loss considerations and not following your plan document. So I think those are the kind of the 2 things. There's a lot of very practical things. We've got, I know you guys are doing these. We're doing a town hall conference call tomorrow morning where I'm going to kind of go through some of the practical implications of, like, for example, this new Families First leave. Is it considered compensation for 401k purposes? Do we need to be pulling deferrals out of these amounts? Do we need to giving a match on the amount? If someone's furloughed, can they take a distribution? Have they severed employment? So some of the practical considerations, more legal, hardcore legal questions, I'll cover in my little weekly call. And if someone wants to email me, I'm happy to send them an invite for that. But I think just broadly for your audience, partial plan terminations on the retirement side, and then stop loss considerations on the health side.
Perfect. Well, thank you. Thank you for the insights, Brandon. And we appreciate so much you being a part of this today to help us and to give that guidance from your perspective. I would just put in one more plug. As Brandon mentioned, both Summit and McAfee were both quite involved with respect to, we have a website, but also our LinkedIn. And so I know Brandon posts, I know that I post. If you want to follow Summit, Kaci, Brandon, Todd on LinkedIn, we are posting pertinent information that employers you can use. And we have a great team of consultants at Summit. We want to be a resource for you. You heard Todd. He is brilliant. He has such a great pulse on the benefit side. So I'm so grateful to have the resources that we have. I'm going to turn it back over to Megan here just for the wrap up. I know we're running a couple minutes behind, but we really appreciate each of you being on today. And do remember, we're all in this together. We will get through it and we will adapt and change, but we'll be better because of it. So Megan, I'm going to pass it back to you to finish up.
Absolutely. Great job. I'd like to thank Brandon, Todd, Kaci for all of your time today and sharing this valuable information. We'd like to thank all of you for joining us in today's session. Such an overwhelming number of people. That was wonderful. Please be sure to follow us on social media. As Kaci had mentioned, we are planning more webinars related to the COVID-19 and its impact. Our next webinar is actually scheduled for next Thursday, April 9th at the same time. And that session will be focused on labor and employment. So please keep an eye out for that information, as we hope you'll be able to join us then. Also, we do have COVID-19 resources available on our website. So please take a look at that for more information. And again, if you had any questions that you would like to be answered, we really want to get those answered. Please just send those questions to marketing@yoursummit.com. and we will respond back as soon as possible. But for now, thank you all very much for joining us. And we hope that you have a great rest of your day and stay safe.